Chapter 9 of Winning His Way by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, in which Frank receives a note bearing the signature of a young lady in whom he is greatly interested. The Mystery of the Benson House was the heading of Frank Morris's story of the strange developments in the history of the reputed haunted mansion which stood close to a bend in the Green River, 3 miles above the outskirts of the town. The article attracted a great deal of notice, and as a consequence there was an unusual demand for Saturday's paper. Duncan Roach read the story through with a sneer. "I'll bet Dan Harwood wrote that, or put Frank Morris up to it," he muttered. "I wonder if he has any suspicions about Benson's. I think it's about time the ghosts gave one or both of those fellows a roasting. It might take some of the freshness out of them." And Duncan grinned in a peculiar way, as if he knew more about the inside workings of the haunted house than appeared in the Argus. Duncan met several of his chums later on, and the bunch went into convulsions of mirth over the mystery of the Benson house. "The fellow who wrote that ought to be initiated into the Society of the Ghosts, don't you think?" suggested Duncan meaningly. "Without actually becoming one, you mean, don't you?" said the nephew of the cashier of the First National Bank, an undersized dudish boy named Peter Winch. "Of course. The membership list of the Ancient Order of Associated Ghosts is full, but the first degree might occasionally be worked to advantage on the inquisitive outsiders." "It would make them smart, at any rate," spoke up Luke Edwards with a sneer, which sadly caused a roar of mirth. "I move that Frank Morris, the boy editor of the Argus, be invited to attend our next roasting bee," said Duncan with a grin. "Second the motion," chuckled Winch. "Those in favor of inviting the learned editor to our coming soiree will please signify it by saying aye," said Edwards, the self-constituted chairman of the crowd. "The motion is unanimous. The chief executioner is instructed to see that a real hot fire is provided for the occasion, in order that our distinguished visitor might have no cause to complain of a lack of warmth in his reception." This provoked another outburst of laughter. "As our expected guest is a member of the unbridled press, it will be the duty of the custodian of records to prepare a true and unvarnished account of the proceedings of the evening, and furnish same to the editor of the Green River Times for publication, in order that the public may be further enlightened into the mysteries of the Benson house, which the Argus has seen fit to introduce to their attention this morning," said Walter Edwards grandiloquently. "Somebody will wish there was snow on the ground before the initiation is concluded," said Duncan significantly. "Or that he could sit on a cake of ice for the sake of variety," chimed in Eddie Hicks. "Or take a swim in the river," suggested another youth of high social standing. "But I say," asked Peter Winch, "suppose he won't come?" "Elsie Gray lives a mile further out that road," said Duncan. "A note of invitation from her will fetch him every time." "How are you going to work that dodge? Elsie and you are on the outs." "Pete's sister could write it. She isn't too sweet on Elsie and would just as soon sign her name to a note as not. Morris won't know the difference, I'll bet. We'll watch for him down the road and run him into Benson's in double-quick time. When we get through with him, he won't be in the humor to write any more ghost stories." Peter Winch thought the idea a good one, and agreed to persuade his sister to help the good work along. On Monday afternoon of the next week, several letters were delivered by the postman at the Argus office. Most of them contained local subscriptions to the paper, and some of them requests for further information concerning the new story without a title, which had been announced in the Saturday issue as a forthcoming novelty. Judging from the first day's results, Frank Morris was encouraged to believe that the new idea would prove a success. The last letter he opened, addressed in a neat, girlish hand, read as follows: "Green River Farm, July 1st, 1905. Dear Mr. Morris, my father having been called to Marshland to be gone overnight, Mother and I would be happy to have you spend the evening at the farm. I have special reasons for hoping you will not disappoint us. Please do come. Yours sincerely, Elsie Gray." Frank was not familiar with Elsie's handwriting, never having received a note from her before, and therefore he had no suspicions of the genuineness of that which he now held in his hand. "I was going to commence my serial tonight," he said to himself, "but I guess it'll have to wait. I couldn't think of disappointing Elsie for a great deal." Indeed, he was highly delighted with the invitation, the more so as it was so unexpected. He was, to tell the truth, very much interested in Farmer Gray's only daughter, who by many people was called the Belle of Green River. She was an uncommonly winsome little creature, and her relations with Frank were of the most cordial nature. He had been much flattered by her call at the office a week before, and this fresh evidence of her friendship quite tickled him. "Yes, I'll go. You bet your suspenders, as Dan would say. I wouldn't miss it for a good deal." Frank was in high spirits that afternoon anyway, for he had succeeded in talking a couple of good advertisers into returning to the fold. Besides that, Dan Harwood had corralled 3 good vendue notices on the way to the Times and piloted them to the Argus, added to which the job department was looking up in a way that put Dan and Jinx on their mettle to turn the stuff out in time. Altogether, this week's editions and the other work promised a profit, instead of the usual loss of many weeks back, so it was natural that the youngest editor in Green River should feel particularly jubilant over the outlook. "I shall not be back after supper tonight as I intended," said Frank to Dan at closing up time. "I'm going out to Farmer Gray's." "I know there must be some attraction to keep you away, bet your suspenders," grinned Dan, eyeing his friend quizzically. Frank blushed in spite of himself. "If I had as pretty a girl as Elsie Gray on the string, I'd feel like shirking work myself for an hour or two," considered Harwood. "It happens to be a special invitation, which I can't very well turn down," explained Frank. "Sure," chuckled Dan. "Don't you believe me? Read that." And Frank handed him the note. "You're a solid man in that quarter, bet your suspenders," said Dan, returning the note. "What nonsense." "No nonsense at all. Her father owes his distinguished position as member from this county to the state legislature to your father's backing. She appreciates the fact, see? You've got the inside track there. Hold on to it. Her father is rich. Green River Farm is the finest in the county. Some day, perhaps." "Dan," said Frank with pretended severity, "it's time you went home. I'm going to supper." End of chapter 9.